2, 1.
Hold on.
It says going live. I think we're there. So
I can't see the text that you had up.
2,
Yeah, but your
1.
text needs to be up on my screen.
Yeah, I could share that real quick. Just give me a sec. It says going live. I think we're there. So
I can't see the text that you had up.
2.
Yeah, but your text needs to be up on my screen.
Yeah, I could share that real quick. Just give me a sec. It says going live. All right, you got that? John, are you with me?
Yeah. Yes, I got it, but it needs to be higher quality. Right. You got to go back to the original.
All right, there we go. Welcome to God is Open. It works. Fantastic. We should have probably done that before we went live, but that works too. Welcome to God is Open. I'm your host, Christopher Fisher, and we have our in-residence Doctor of Physics, Dr. Jonathan Fisher, and we are going to be talking about contradictions in the classical attributes of God. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. How are you?
It's a good day. I got to sleep in, which is the best days ever when you do get to sleep in. So that's always good. Well, I spent this morning putting together... I'm sorry?
Like all the weekends?
Like all weekends, not all weekends. Sometimes I have things to do. But I spent part of this morning putting together some of these definitions of these classical attributes, as we find. Primarily, we're going to be drawing from Stephen Charnock, from The Existence and Attributes of God, because this is one of the more thorough of the books. A lot of these books just touch on things tangentially, and they kind of move on, because sometimes it's unclear if the authors themselves understand the concepts that they're trying to describe, how familiar they are. But he actually goes in fairly solid detail about what these various attributes actually mean. But I thought maybe we'd start out with Thomas Aquinas, our good buddy, who says that God is pure act. God is, let's grab the Latin term over here. He's actus purus, and pure act. So what that means in Thomas Aquinas's mind is that nothing could act on God. God is pure act. There's no potentiality in God, and there's no potency. So Wikipedia is actually pretty good on this. According to Thomas Aquinas, a thing which requires completion by another is said to be in potency to that others. Realization of potency is called actuality. The universe is conceived as a series of things arranged in an ascending order, or potency and act at once crowned and created by God, who alone is pure act. And so there's a starting assumption in classical theism that God is pure act. That means he does not have potential to be otherwise. Anything with potential is not absolute being. Anything that's not absolute being cannot be God. Does that make sense in your mind?
No, but I know the argument.
Yeah, so
but I don't think I buy it.
Yeah, so the buying the argument's different than understanding the argument. So this goes along with various other attributes of God's perfection. God is said to be the greatest being. And one area or attribute that these systematic theologies always tend to start off with is God's ineffability. God cannot be described positively. He can only be described negatively, because if you were to positively ascribe anything to God, you'd be adding parts to God. God could be divided. He would have discursive differences, discrete differences from one part of him to another, And God has to be pure being. He cannot have parts. And so as such, he must be ineffable. This is one of the highest attributes of God. So let's see what Charnook says about this. This way of negation is more easy. We better understand what God is not than what he is. And most of our knowledge of God is by this way, as when we say God is infinite, immense, immutable. These are negatives. He has no limits, is confined to no place, admits no change. When we remove him from what is inconsistent with his being, we do not more strongly assert his being and know more of him when we elevate him above all and above all our own capacity. And so we can only describe God in the negative because ascribing things that are positive to him creates parts, creates change. He's higher than that. He is infinitely higher. He says we don't have any terms to express or conceive of him by if we transfer to God in our honor, because spirit is the highest excellency in our nature, yet we must apprehend God above any spirit, since his nature is so great that he cannot be declared by human speech, perceived by human sense, or conceived by human understanding. So this is the attribute of ineffability. We can't say anything positive about God. We can only approximate him in the negative sense. Negative attributes. So this goes along with simplicity. Simplicity is the next attribute of God. Yeah.
Just real quick, this is a standard called negative theology, and there is such a thing called positive theology, but which I believe Eastern Orthodox tend to propose. But in terms of the Western canon, this is basically the standard, the reason for negative theology.
Right. So sometimes people will say, well, God has these positive attributes and then these negative attributes, the incomprehensible or the incommunicable attributes which can't be ascribed to, and then the communicable attributes. But they'll always make the communicable attributes subservient to the incommunicable ones. So they'll say God is immutable. Yeah, but God has love, and we kind of understand love, but he's immutable. He's changeless. He's impassible, meaning he doesn't have any passions, which include love. And so they have to redefine love. They say it's a positive attribute, this love, but it's not the type of love that we might have towards our children. That's something that's discrete, something that is tangible. God's method of love is like a universal. It's all encompassing. It's part of his nature. It doesn't change. It doesn't shift. It's a love unlike our love. And we see that expressed here. And down here in the immutability quotes, we talk about, he talks about God's body parts. God can't have body parts, he says, because body parts create parts, and God has to be simple. He has to be immutable. If he had parts, he could decay. So when the Bible talks about these body parts, it's just using language that can register in our minds. It's condescending language, as he writes in this book. So simplicity is our next attribute that's pretty fundamental to classical theism. It says, if God were not spirit, he cannot be creator. All multitude begins in and is reduced to unity. Remember, Plotinus is the one, Plato's the one. God has to be absolute unity. He has to be absolute simple. As above the multitude, there is an absolute unity. So above mixed creatures, there is absolute simplicity. You cannot conceive number without conceiving the beginning of it in that which is not a number, a unit. You cannot conceive any mixture. You must conceive some more simple things to be the original and basis of it. So if God had parts, and these parts are divisible, those parts which are divisible out of the whole are more primary and must be the creator or greater than that which has parts, which has multiplicity. Are you following his logic there?
Yep.
Yeah. So it says, if God therefore had a body, the perfection of deity would depend upon every part of that body. The more parts that he's compounded of, the more his dependency would be multiplied. If you have parts, you have dependencies. God can't have dependencies. If you have parts, you have change, because those different parts, they could change in relation to another, which causes degradation, which means that a compounded essence, as we go down to his definition of immutability. If his essence is compounded, it can't be God essence. His essence must be pure simplicity. Back up to the simplicity, and because God would be dependent being, if he had a body, he would not be the first being. For the compounding parts are in order of nature, which is compounded in them, as the soul and body are before the man, which results from the union of them. So whatever is compounded has a greater than itself, which is the simple, the parts by themselves, rather than the compounded being. So immutability, God can't change. If God were spirit... Oh, go for it.
Wait. So simplicity is that it could appear as though this is not negative theology, because you're actually making a positive statement that a simple being, right? But I think they don't consider it that, because you're basing the parts, so you can still phrase it in terms of a negative, and they tend to do that with their definition.
Right, so the one that Plotinus talks about is not supposed to be even the concept of a one single unit. It's not a discursive thing. It's beyond conceivability. And so even assigning it the name the one is inaccurate in his theology. So going back to this immutability, it says, whatsoever is compounded is changeable in its own nature, and it should never be changed. So going on, it says, God is unchangeable in his essence, nature, and perfections. Immutability and eternity are linked. So he also distinguishes eternity. Eternity doesn't mean that God has lived forever and will live forever, but eternity in his mind is God is outside the bounds of time. God is not subject to sequential events to change, because remember, if God is at one point at 6 o'clock and then another point at 7 o'clock, that causes parts, that causes change, that causes degradation. So his idea of eternity has to supersede. Hey, are you with me?
Yep, I can hear you.
I lost internet real quick there. I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah, so the whole time you're talking, it like freezes every 5 seconds and then starts up again. Is that your internet? Is spotty right now?
It should be. I got like the fastest modem and the fastest
that's
internet.
That's what I assumed. But of course, all your kids are on it all at the same time.
Maybe I should knock them all off of the internet and say, none for you kids. I think it's because I'm doing so much streaming. We're going, let's take a look at this. I am streaming to you, and then I was streaming back into YouTube. And so what we'll do is...
I could just look at your YouTube.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. That's the easy thing to do about that.
All right.
So we'll go there. Where did we leave off with Omnipotence?
Okay. I'll have to mute you, but I think I can see it. That'll work.
All right. Do we have a live feed that you know of?
It's not very recent,
right?
With, with my video, but I don't know about my voice. I'm not listening to that.
All right. So I think we are good to go. Okay. Did we talk about omnipotence? Did you hear about that?
Just go where you left off. I understand these attributes.
Okay,
for the sake of the audience.
Omnipresence is God is above space and time. It doesn't mean like he's in every square inch of every like a house or anything like that. God transcends space and time. Much like eternity means he transcends minutes and seconds. Omnipotence is interesting. It's more than God is able to do all things. Since God doesn't have discursive thought, and he can't do discursive things, and he doesn't have potentiality in him, all his acts are emanations of his essence. And this is how it is described. It belongs in regard of the inconceivable excellency and activity of his essence. This is his power. And omnipotence is nothing but the divine essence, affectatious ad extra. It is his essence as operative and the immediate principle of operation, as the power of enlightening in the sun and the power of heat in the fire. Which is interesting because in Plotinus, of course, the one can't have active principles working on the world, because you can't assign power and act to the one. So in this regard, Augustine and Christian classical theism departs from classic Platonism, because they want to assign an attribute called omnipotence and assign that to God in addition to all these other attributes. And this is going to be one of their downfalls, because this contradicts other things that they believe. So omniscience is the last one we'll talk about. This is pretty simple. I underlined some things here. God's knowledge is non-discursive, it's eternal, it's absolute, it's simple. It doesn't come from outside himself. It's not generated from like looking at the future and then knowing what free creatures are going to do. Because as Charnock argues, that would make the creatures superior to God. So if God is gaining his knowledge based on looking to see what free action creatures are going to do, they are more powerful than God. They're more primary than God. They are more God than God if he gets from them, if he receives from them. Self-sufficiency is another attribute we didn't put up here. God's aseity. These types of ideas is God cannot gain from things that are not God. God can't gain at all, actually. But if God did gain, if God did change, if he did receive from outside himself, he would not be God, because he's not most primary. So this type of knowledge is simple, ungenerated, eternal, innate, and in God himself. He does not know by discourse. He doesn't think things. He doesn't reason from one thing to another to gain this knowledge. It is innate in God's character. So this podcast here is about contradictions in the attributes of God. I'll let you go first, and we could deal with any and all contradictions you may see.
Well, first of all, I wanted to point out that this all is basically trying to come up with derivations from a very simple proposition, which is what we introduced everything with. God is simple, therefore God cannot change. Or God is perfect, therefore God cannot change. Everything else flows from this notion of changelessness. It's creating this concept of potentiality and actuality, and then every other concept flows from it. Well, if you have to be pure actuality, you must be outside of time, because you are guaranteed to have potential just to be inside time, right?
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. So James Dwezel, he's the primary modern scholar on simplicity, and in his book, he basically needs to convince his readers that the world is not co-necessary with God. So the logic goes like this: if God is necessary and his omniscience is necessary, the contents of his omniscience is also necessary. That means the world is equally as necessary, because if the world had potentiality, then the object of God's knowledge would also have potentiality to be something different. And so do you know how he responds to this? Take a wild guess. Wild guess.
Okay, he just says no, I don't accept it.
He appeals to mystery.
Oh my goodness.
He appeals to mystery. He says, "Oh,
so
it's
basically the same." It's basically the same as just saying, "Nah."
Yeah, he's like, it's somehow the world isn't necessary.
Well,
but the object of God's knowledge is necessary. The content of God's knowledge is necessary, and God is necessary. But the world is not somehow.
But this illustrates how comical it is, because everything is a logical derivation from this concept of pure actuality. That's the whole reason these divine attributes exist. So then you just sort of hand wave your way out of it. It's silly, right?
Absolutely. It's silly in Plotinus as well. Plotinus said reality is an overflow or outpouring, a reflection of the one. So things can't be created by the one. That's potentiality. That's change. That makes God non-simple. And so reality just kind of spawns itself based on a reflection of God without touching God. That's kind of like how the Calvinists say that God doesn't receive glory from us. When the Bible talks about glory to God, it's talking about maximizing God's glory in creation, reflecting God's glory, because God cannot receive from us. It's not like something we do can give God benefit for these reasons that we've covered already, because that would make him non-primary. That would make something greater than God. That would make him dependent in this philosophy. And so it's the same thing. So that's one of the very, very elementary criticisms of classical theism, is it really does make all things co-equal and co-necessary with God.
Yeah.
And just the definition of those terms, in the same way that God is necessary, all of creation, you and me, my cat pooping on my carpet because the litter box is full and the kids haven't cleaned it in days, that's co-necessary with God. That's how those things
also
work.
it makes a joke of the commentary, like able to do all things, omnipotent. He's able to do all things because literally nothing else could ever happen in any way, shape, or form, right?
Right, except for
it's not even like a meaningful declaration of power at that point. It's just saying the universe exists.
So we'll turn to omnipotence. And in omnipotence, let's see what he says here. That omnipotence means God is able to do all things. And he also says, hence it follows that because the power is essentially in God, more operations of God are possible than are exerted. So he's saying, in his claims, this is Charnock, he's the same guy we've read for every other attribute. He claims that there's more possibilities in God than are exerted. God could have done
potential,
other things.
Then. That's potential.
That 100% is potential. He's adding potentiality to God, although he just disclaimed it over and over again in all his other attributes. It's not a consistent. God can do all things. There's things that God can do that God doesn't do, meaning God has potential. God could be other than what God is. God is not immutable. Immutability is not a property of God. So right off the bat, his own definition of omnipotence contradicts his definitions of simplicity and immutability, and the concept, which I didn't find it in his book, of pure actuality, but to be sure he would believe those if presented with Aquinas on those issues, that God is pure act, because he already affirms it in simplicity and in immutability, impassibility, all those things. He's affirming these ideas. So he wants to have his cake and eat it too.
I have to wonder, like, how does he qualify as a classical theist at this point? I mean, presumably all the classical theists end up doing this, right? And so where 100%. Are they even drawing the line? Like, what is their standard for why you're not one? If you could just basically use all the terms and rewrite them however you feel.
Well, the funny thing about Doezel, who I've mentioned before, is he's exclusionary. And so he takes Norman Geisler, and he says, Norman Geisler, no, not Norman Geisler, Bruce Ware. He says, Bruce Ware, in responding to open theists, says that God has emotions. Well, this causes change. Bruce Ware is basically an open theist. And so he wants to kick...
Yeah.
So depends how consistent they are and how exclusionary they are. But I think they would rather open their gates wide, accept more people, and then have micro criticisms against each other in a subset rather than to exclude. Because if they're fractioning on these issues, then they lose all semblance of control, of some sort of overarching tradition that they can adhere to. So I think the general rule is, if you talk like this, It doesn't matter how consistent or how inconsistent you are, you're going to be swept into that broad brush, into that big tent with everyone else.
It's just a club that they're using. I think they probably just want you to go through their seminaries and start speaking like them then, because your actual MDiv or whatever you get from the seminaries seems to matter a lot to them.
It sure does. I don't know how much value it has on the marketplace, so it better give them some sort of emotional validation.
Exactly. You got to make the club so that you make your whole education have value.
It's like history professors. Like, what do you do with that? You just have to be a history professor yourself. It's like, I kind of know what I do with this. Okay, so omnipotence. God can do everything. But if that's to be bounced off against simplicity and immutability, God really can't do everything. He can't do other than what's been eternally...
Yeah, but by definition, that's everything.
Okay, in that sense, but not in the sense that he says that there's more operations in God that are possible, that are exerted. And so, yeah, that is true. By definition, that is everything. So if God foreknew that my fingers would wiggle in this manner, there was never a possibility, even though we can imagine it in our head, would say, oh, the pinky could have went up for 2 seconds and went down for 1, even though it only went up for 1 and then went down for 2. Even though we can imagine these possibilities in our head, they never were an actual possibility. They could not have actualized because everything's necessary with God. It's part of God's necessary knowledge that God has necessarily had, which is necessarily identical. The contents of God's knowledge are identical with all his other attributes. That's another thing to think about when it comes to omniscience. The thoughts are not discursive. It's not like God could think about a memory in his head, like you and I could sit here and remember maybe a childhood event. God's knowledge doesn't function like that because those are parts. You can't divide your memory into parts in God's knowledge. You can't have distinct thoughts, like one thought over here and one thought over here. All of it is in a immutable soup that's co-equal, co-eternal, at the forefront of God's mind. Things don't 1 + 1 = 2. There's no sequence in that. It's all co-equal. That's God's knowledge there.
Yeah. So this is one of the big problems with negative theology, is that they're so afraid of giving any sort of definition to God that he becomes nothingness. And I think even a lot of atheist critiques are saying he is basically, like, you can say exactly the same things about nothing as this, but there's no concept behind everything. You're just trying to do everything through negation, and you're not pushing his theory. Like, supposedly science is done through negation too, right? Because you're always trying to disprove something, and so you only disprove the theory, but you still have the theory, right? You have a positive theory, and then you go through and try to negate it. In this case, there is no positive theory. It's just a denial of knowledge altogether.
And so that's one of the arguments I've made previously, that in negative theology, God's indistinguishable from nothingness. And so the laws of physics, you could kind of abstractly consider the laws of physics like nothingness. They're just ways that the world operates. You wouldn't really say that they're like a thing. And in the same way, God is just a facet of the universe, just forcing everything to happen that does happen in specific ways necessarily, even if he has a quote-unquote an active element that doesn't... He is... how our friend Charnook here describes, he's the heat behind the sun or something like that. God makes the entire world necessary. There's no options for anything else. We got a question, not a question, but a comment by Wilson in the comments. Creation by definition requires potential. If there's no potential, then creation is just an emanation and overflow rather than an actual creation. Which is absolutely correct. If it's a nothing. It's not God doing something positively even. It's a force facet of the world. We're in fatalism if this system is true.
Yeah, there's an irony. When you create the eternal now, you don't have this distinction between what's in time and what's not time. In fact, everything becomes out of time. And in fact, everything's just an illusion. And creation is included in that, right? Creation, just like any other act, is a new act potential, but it's always existed, and God has always emanated it outside of time. Then it itself is just an illusion. And that is what I think was it Parmenides who was making that argument, one of the ancient Greek philosophers, on that very basis.
The writings of Parmenides are kind of scattered. I think I quote him in full. I think I quoted him in full in one of my previous podcasts. But Plato has a big writing on Parmenides in which he talks about the one. And that's one of the most Neoplatonic works of Plato, the actual Plato, that we have in existence, talking about change and immutability and division. And that's what it's all about. This is the things that they really cared about. Let's see, omnipotence. So one of the reasons that we're having this podcast today is because there was a guy I was interacting with on simplicity. He wanted to say, hey, I think simplicity is true. I'm like, well, you really can't have that. For example, in omniscience, if God learned something, he said, oh, God could learn something. Jesus could learn something, so God could learn something. Well, that's not actually allowed in classical theism. That's actually a violation of simplicity. If Jesus is God and Jesus learned something, it doesn't matter if God the Father knew the thing that Jesus learned. Jesus the human learning something, adding to him, violates simplicity, immutability, this definition of omniscience. Remember, all things cannot be discrete. All things must be the same thing. They can't have parts. They can't have dependencies. Parts and learning from outside yourself creates dependencies, means you're not God. Are you familiar?
Yes. So that creates I don't know exactly off the top of my head what the classical theist response is to the notion of Jesus being fully God and fully man.
You want me to tell you?
Yeah, what's
You want me to tell you why I was blocked by James White on Twitter?
It's okay.
I asked him, was the human part of Jesus God?
Yeah.
Okay, so then I ask Calvinists this all the time. Was the human part of Jesus God? And either they hem and haw, like, oh, you don't understand the hypostatic. I think I do understand the hypostatic union. I think I do. Augustine, his solution was that Jesus was kind of a being that was in time, eternally predestined to do various acts that doesn't actually have overlap with the God substance. Much like the voice from heaven that he talks about in his Confessions, chapter 11, the voice in heaven wasn't actually God speaking, but an eternally predestined creature in time making those sound waves for us to hear.
You're not believing in the God-man at that point. You do not believe Jesus is fully God and fully man. You just believe in some sort of possession of a body.
Yeah, they believe God is fully God or Jesus is fully God and fully man. Just that
they don't believe he's fully man,
but they don't believe that the fully man part of him was fully God. That's literally what the hypostatic union teaches. People don't understand this, and so just asking them the simple question, "Was the human part of Jesus God?" Really riles them up because
they don't want to say it.
They don't want to say it. I've
believe it, but they don't want to say it.
I've gotten maybe 3 Calvinists out of like 50 to say no. The human part of Jesus was not God. I've gotten like 3 out of 50. The other 47 didn't want to answer the question. They just responded, "You don't understand the hypostatic union." Well, I'm not even making any claims. I'm just asking a question. I'm trying to gather some information about your beliefs. And so that's the claim. So Jesus can't learn, the God part of Jesus can't learn in classical theism, because that would be a violation of the God attributes that we already had. So if you're claiming that the human part of Jesus was God, you have now added division to simplicity. You've added change to immutability. You've added presence to omnipresence. You added impotency to omnipotence, omnipotence. It's funny that in Charnock's description of omnipotence, he says, a creature which can die is impotent. And now Jesus died, so... well... I guess. So that's why in traditional theism, hypostatic union, Jesus, the human part of Jesus, cannot be God. And so I went back and forth with this guy on simplicity, trying to hash out what it actually means and what omniscience means. So he tried to make the claim that some of my examples were not logical. I said, as a human being, I could forget something. Does God have the power? Is he powerful enough to choose to forget something? Is that something God can do? And so you always hear them appeal to things like, well, God can't make a square circle, and God can't make a burrito so hot that he can't eat it, because those incorporate contradictory things, some premises that
right. Logical impossibilities.
But here's the thing: I could forget stuff, and so if I could do something and God can't do that, it's not like the thing I'm doing is a logically non-existent. It's like that thing doesn't exist. It's a thing we know that does exist, and God not being able to do it means God can't do all things. And so, what do you think his appeal was? How do you think he responded?
Well, even saying you could die, right, is
right.
So I don't know, like if I put myself in a Calvinist position, I would basically say in the context of God, it's a logical impossibility. So I'll try to stick with the same argument.
Right. And so here's how that happens. Here's how that works. Can God choose not to be somewhere? They would say no, because that contradicts his omnipotence. And if he could not be in a location, but just notice what they did there. They just shifted their priority of attributes. They just said one attribute trumps another. You could just as easily argue that it's logically inconsistent for God not to be able to be everywhere, because that violates his omnipotence. So they'll make one subservient to other. They'll say omniscience entails that God must know all facts. Therefore, it's logically inconsistent that God can do everything, including forgetting facts. Whereas they could have just as easily, with the same turn of breath, the same logic, said it makes no sense that God can't decide to forget things or not be in a location, because that violates his omnipotence, being able to do everything. There's no rhyme or reason, rather than what they logically prioritize in their own mind for what they want to adhere to.
Yeah, so all of these attributes come from some sort of logical flow and assumptions, but you're pinning them down, and you're saying that they have to pick a certain flow to define your other attributes.
Yeah, so there's a definite reason that the Platonists, they discarded omnipotence, having active agency, being able to do things, because what does that do? That necessitates that God has potentiality, one, and it necessitates that these other attributes now have parts.
Like it's in the word, right? Omnipotent. It says all potent. Pure potentiality is what omnipotence actually means. If it's like it is the exact opposite of pure actuality to call something omnipotent.
Yeah, that is true. So pure actuality means that God has no potency. God has no potentiality. And so omnipotence is, in fact, as you point out, the opposite of pure actuality. It's the opposite of simplicity. If God can do things that are not eternally part of him, if he has the potency to achieve, that's an act. And acts have time, acts have distinction, acts have parts, and that violates his simplicity. It also makes him dependent on creation, because we remember back to our dependencies. If God is able to interact with the world, that means the world is not subservient to him, that he's subservient to the world, because he's gaining and interacting with things outside himself. This violates all these attributes: immutability specifically, simplicity, and pure actuality. So it's not like we're making any of this stuff up either. I mean, I don't know of any. My problems with modern atheists is they don't understand classical theism or classical arguments or classical apologetics in any meaningful way. I had done an interview with Skylar Fiction where I wanted to actually just talk to him about the Kalam cosmological argument, and he had never even heard of it. And so I'm sitting there dumbfounded that So I'm sitting here dumbfounded that this supposed, apologist against Christians have never even heard this basic theology. I can't find atheists to talk to who actually understand what's going on here and understand what classical theism actually believes in order to have meaningful conversations. And so that definitely is problematic. But I did read, I don't know if you've ever read the book, George H. Smith's Atheism, the Case Against God.
I've read snippets.
Yeah, so in that, I got a bunch of highlights from it. And he talks about some of these he talks about negative theology, and he's very good at describing problems with negative theology. For example, not being able to distinguish God from nothingness. And he argues against Molinistic ideas that there are possible worlds, even in the Christian theology. So he's very good there. But he also points out some of these contradictions in omniscience and omnipotence, God being able to do everything. If God can do all things, then we necessarily have to deny immutability. We have to deny omnipotence, or omnipresence, omniscience, and any other attribute. We didn't even grab all the attributes. There's still other attributes we got here. God's eternity, God being outside space and time. Those types of things must be denied just for the simple attribute of omnipotence. So, in my estimation, Christians would be better off dropping that as one of their distinguishing features and just converting to pure Platonism. They'd be a little bit better, even though still Platonism doesn't make too much sense in how the world is spawned by reflecting against the one. Are you with me?
Yeah. Yeah, I was just checking some of the comments. So, it's like everything is just what's really happening is that they're shoehorning the classical theists were shoehorning Platonism into Christianity, and they were doing that specifically because Platonism was what the intellectuals believed at the time. So they had to try to find a way to get it in. But God obviously in the Bible is interacting with people all the time. So omnipotence had to be a key portion of that, despite the fact that it breaks apart every other bit of classical theology or of Platonism.
Yeah, absolutely. I would compare it to modern Christians trying to shoehorn evolution into the Bible. Oh yes, the Bible affords for evolution, so you don't have to read day like day. It could be a long period, and then there's some evolution in there somewhere.
It's exactly the same concept. You look at what the intellectuals of the time believe, and then you try to make Christianity a part of that.
It's like they totally believed it. They totally believed that we evolved from sea creatures. Like I don't know about that. I think you might be missing something there. I think that may in fact be incorrect. Just probably.
I'll send you a link later, but basically anytime any of the church fathers at any moment talk about this, they believe in a young earth, right?
Yeah.
There's some claim that they didn't, like, oh yeah, Augustine definitely didn't because he allegorized all of Genesis. But you got to realize that Augustine basically thinks the allegorizing of the Old Testament is the most important way to interpret, but he doesn't deny the non-allegorical form. And so even Augustine believed in a young earth. I'll send you some of the links.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. I don't think it was intellectual option really at their time period.
Exactly.
It's one of these It's like Philo of Alexandria thinking that Moses was talking about Neoplatonism in his descriptions. Like Moses definitely believed in Platonism because he has God in a burning bush, and fire is the primary atom in this world because, you got the four elements, so earth and fire, or water, air, and fire was the most primary. So he definitely understood. And guess what? This is actually what they write. Aristobulus writes this about Plato, that Plato had access to Greek translations of Moses and actually learned all his philosophy from Moses writing on Mount Sinai. And this is in Alexandria, which this claim is said, and then it's repeated. It's repeated by Philo, by Clement, Augustine, Eusebius, in his preparation for the gospel, writes all sorts of people who talk about this, and their consistent claim was Platonism is not, yeah, you know what, Platonism's all good and well, but guess what? Plato actually learned everything he taught from Moses.
But Moses apparently didn't write it down for us.
Because, Moses was in Egypt.
Yeah, but apparently Moses never wrote these things in any sense that Plato wrote them, so...
Yeah, you just have to read into everything. That was one of the things they did.
It's so comical though, because it's like you can see the code behind a person's arguments. Once you understand what's going on, you know exactly why they're going to say what they're going to say. And a lot of times when you get presented all this information, just like if you're some brand new Christian or something, you get presented a lot of information. You don't know where it's coming from or why they're saying this, and you kind of have to nod. But as soon as you see exactly how they're shoehorning and why they're shoehorning, they just look comical every time you hear them talk about it.
Oh, so funny. Yeah, I did definitely agree. You got to look at what people are saying, why they're saying it, how they're saying it. And I think it's funny when things come full circle. And so you have modern day Calvinists arguing for primacy of the Bible, and they don't know where all their basic foundations are coming from. And so when they are presented with what the Bible actually says, they're dumbfounded, why would the Bible say that? And why do I believe what I believe? And then you see them trying out various attempts because they've lost the plot. The circle, at some point, they're not familiar with the history of how they got to their current position.
Right. They were never taught the shoehorning. They were just taught the end result.
So the funniest thing is when I was on this Calvinist webpage and I put a poll question, do you affirm divine simplicity? There's 100 votes, and 50% said yes, and 50% said, I'll let you guess, 50% said,
I don't know.
I'm not familiar with it. And so I'm in the comments trying to argue to Calvinists what Calvinists believe. I'm not even arguing my own position. I'm saying this is literally what divine simplicity is. It's literally taught in Calvinism. And I'm arguing against people. They've never heard of divine simplicity. They're like, oh no, Calvinism doesn't teach that. Yeah, it does. Here's the quotes. What do you think's going on here? No, it doesn't say that. This is literally your theology. It's one of the most primary attributes of God that feeds into everything else. And so some Calvinists, modern Calvinists, will say God knows the future because God decrees it. Well, guess what? That violates simplicity. It violates immutability. It violates classical omniscience. It violates God's omnipotence because you're making God's knowledge dependent on an action. You're making it discursive. You're giving it parts. You're giving potentiality into God. This is not what Calvinists believe. They do not believe God knows because God decreed. The people who don't know Calvinism, who claim to be Calvinists, they might believe it, but normal Calvinist systematic theology does not believe it because it contradicts all their attributes. But they don't know it. They don't know their own theology.
Yeah, it's this is why I was trying to understand what exactly makes a Calvinist a Calvinist. If they don't know their own theology and it's just some sort of insiders club. You don't have to know anything. You just have to not be antagonistic towards people who are making random claims.
If you're antagonistic towards outsiders, you are now an insider, though. And so it's a signaling thing where all you have to be is adversarial towards your common enemy, in group, out group. They're not part of the group. We attack them.
Yep.
So I was dealing in this other group with two Calvinists, and I'm saying, what am I saying exactly? That the writers of the Old Testament didn't believe in Calvinism. They believed in basically open theism. And there's a Calvinist who's one of these progressive Calvinists who thinks that the Bible, as the Bible was written in the New Testament, they understood God more fully than the Old Testament. And they just kind of had a hazy conception of God in the Old Testament. And so what I'm saying is correct, that these people did visualize God in the open theistic sense, but then they grew and they progressed and they learned better about the attributes of God. And so I'm fighting against this other Calvinist.
Wait. So what do they say about the inerrancy of the scripture then?
Well, they'd be denying the type of inerrancy that's like a literalism. But I'm interacting with a different Calvinist who wants traditional inerrancy and saying he wants to say that the Bible writers throughout had the same conception about God as the God of Calvinism. Who do you think that the first guy sided with? And who do you think he attacked?
Obviously, the in-group, and he attacked you.
Yeah, he said, you're wrong, Chris. Although you're right about the details about the Old Testament writers believing this and this and this, you're wrong, and you need to. It is total insider outsider. They don't care about. He was agreeing with me against this other guy, but he would not stand up against this guy and argue my position as a Calvinist against his fellow Calvinist. In group, out group. It was crazy. Yeah. All right. So, any other attributes, contradictions we have going on here? I don't know how long the stream is so far. Let's see. We got about an hour of stream. I don't know, plus or minus the time where my internet went out. We'll see. We'll have to see what kind of streamed there. But anything else we want to talk about?
Plato was a pre-Christ Christian.
That's what they argue. That is what they argue.
Yeah. It's got to be and why just Plato? Like, how does Plato magically get all this? No one else apparently is a pre-cult Christian.
That was funny. In Denver, I was talking to one Calvinist at the Will Duffy debate, and we're talking about Plato and Platonism and Christianity, and he kept saying, "You mean Aristotle?" I'm like, no, I don't mean Aristotle. I mean Plato. Who cares about Aristotle? Zero people care about Aristotle. Yes, he's a famous name, but everyone cared about the affiliations of Plato and the teachings of Plato. Aristotle was a piker.
Aristotle completely repudiated a huge part. Like he didn't believe in the one at all, for example. So I don't know why you would bring him up.
It's funny. But it's one of those things where it's like, I know more than you about this subject, so I'm going to try to correct you on minor details. And then the correction's like all over the place. It's like, this is what we deal with.
It's a posturing. That's what it's about.
Immutability, God cannot change in any respect. If God creates, then God has mutability. That's an action. Creation's an action. If God does anything, learns anything new, if God becomes man. So let's say John, the book of John is saying that God became man when it says the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and the word was God. We'll say that is a change being depicted there. That has to be rejected. If that is a change, that does have to be rejected because that would violate immutability. God cannot change. God cannot do new things. God cannot assume parts, get parts in any sense. There's nothing that can be added and taken away from God. We can't even describe God positively, which reminds me very much of the ancient Gnostics, who were some of the first teachers. If you read Against Heresies, it talks about how they talk about God as being the one ineffable one that's above comprehension, beyond description. Because these Gnostics were very early Christian Platonists, and they infested the world at the time. These are the things they cared about. I don't know if you know this, but Plotinus has an entire section in the Enneads when he's responding to the Gnostics, as like an equal philosophical branch that he actually has to vie with, because these people are out there, he's familiar with them, and he has to respond to their arguments about creation and the demiurge. These are the people that he's interacting with.
Yeah, I think ineffability is really interesting because it seems to be a complete reaction against the classical Greek gods, right? Who are very human in their actions and motivations. And so there's this sort of like almost like a childlike reaction that says, not only is God greater than that, he's so far that you can't even describe it. You can't even think about it. Like you know how a kid just says, like, you're arguing and he says, I believe in that twice as much. I'm right 2 times. I'm right infinity times. Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Yeah, I think so. I think Plato was a little bit tempered by the killing of Socrates, but I don't think it was too much. I think it wasn't too much. Because sometimes he'll talk about Greek gods, but it's always like tongue in cheek, and then he'll talk about the one in Parmenides. Yeah. But it does seem like a reaction. What's that ancient quote that if the horses had gods, they'd be in the shape of horses, and that was their mindset. That it couldn't be that God makes man in his image, and so that was the Christian belief, that there's God and then man's made in his image. It couldn't be that. It had to be the reverse. And not only is it not the reverse, but that God making man in his image, us being in the image of God, is evidence against those gods being like us. So it's chicken and the horse type of thing going on there.
Chicken and the horse.
Chicken and the horse. You can't put the horse before the chicken.
Yeah. I definitely won't do that.
Okay, so did you hear the story of the young Isaac Newton? And he had to take care of the horses every day, and that was one of his daily chores. And so one day his dad comes out, and he's in the barn, and he's reading René Descartes, and he said, "Young Newton, you can't put Descartes before the horses."
Well, I didn't hear that story.
No.
I still wish I hadn't.
It's chicken egg, cart and the horse thing. Put the chicken behind.
That's how it works.
That's how that works. All right. Well, we'll let you go. We'll cut off there. I think it's been a good episode. What's been your favorite part of this episode? We'll do a Michael Malice. You're shaking your head.
Yeah, it's actually this notion that all things have to be co-equal with God. I think that's the most comical part of this whole thing. That the intention is to make God so beyond everything and all things that you can't even describe him, and yet the very concept forces everything to become God.
Yeah, everything to be God. Absolutely. And they just appeal to mystery to try to undo that, because they understand what it does. They understand that all our actions being known from all eternity makes us as eternal as God. Mm-hmm. We are co-equal to God in their system. And it's an appeal to mystery that they do. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the program, and thanks for talking about this. Any questions and comments, put that down below. Thank you for
watching. For joining.
Let's see.